In one of our previous episodes, we talked about the radioactive Boy Scout, who, at the age of 17, built a homemade nuclear breeder reactor in a shed next to his house on the outskirts of Detroit. But now you will see even more outrageous inventions. Who knows? Maybe one of our subscribers already has a portable nuclear reactor for generating energy in their basement. It seems like science fiction. Let's take a look. We'll start with some well-known cases and finish with the most amazing examples. Let's go. Richard Hendle collected radioactive parts for his home reactor, including old clock hands, smoke detectors, and even uranium and thorium. He wrote about all his experiments for about half a year on his blog, but the police only noticed him when he himself wrote a letter to the Radiation Safety Service to ask the authorities whether his experiment was legal. Hendle was arrested and found guilty of violating the radiation safety law and the environmental law. After the trial, he was sentenced to a small fine of €1,500 and released. It would seem like just another story about an uneducated oddball. But what would you say about a world-famous company that hid a small reactor in its basement for 30 years? The well-known company Kodak, a manufacturer of photographic equipment, admitted that since 1974 it had owned a small nuclear reactor. Only a few people knew about the installation. The reactor was located in the basement of Kodak's headquarters in Rochester, New York. The company itself claims that for more than 30 years, the nuclear installation did not pose the slightest danger to those around it. Nevertheless, the reactor operated on almost 1.5 kilograms of uranium enriched to 93%. That's already a level sufficient for use in an atomic bomb. A nuclear reactor the size of a regular refrigerator was located in a basement with concrete walls 60 centimeters thick and was operated remotely. Neither the city authorities nor the state authorities knew about its existence. The thing is, private companies aren't allowed to have such reactors or work with active radioactive material at all, right? However, it seemed that in the 70s, the United States government approved the release of such reactors for large companies, and 2 reactors were produced under this program. One of them was sent to the United States Department of Energy, and the other was actually bought by the Kodak company. It turns out that a truly home-sized nuclear reactor was already created quite a long time ago, and apparently it operated steadily for all 30 years. But such stations can't really be called portable, though they can definitely be considered mobile. Miniature units the size of a standard shipping container can supply up to 10 megawatts for 10 years without refueling. The reactors are completely autonomous and safe, require no maintenance, and after their service life ends, they are simply recharged for another 10 years. The reactors can be used both for power generation and for heating. Such a station can power an entire village or a small town. The most similar in terms of operating principle are the most common reactors that were installed at Russian nuclear power plants. Uranium nitride is used as fuel, which has higher thermal conductivity. It's simple here. The higher the reactor temperature, the higher the steam temperature, and as a result, the higher the performance of the steam turbine that generates energy. The unit with fuel and cooling system has a mass of 20 tons and is designed for 10 years of operation, without refueling. The entire system can be transported by trucks. Upon arrival at the site, the barrel with the reactor is simply buried with access to it, and no maintenance is expected at all. After the warranty period expires, the barrel is dug up and sent back to the manufacturer for refueling. According to the designers, the features of the construction make these reactors safe. Overheating and explosion are impossible because the pressure does not increase as the temperature rises. The developers of the technology assure that this reactor will never reach a supercritical mode. And if someone intentionally damages the vessel, the active material will cool down quickly, and the reactor itself will turn into an iron block isolated by a thick layer of lead. Well, fine. Everyone knows about nuclear icebreakers and submarines. But what about putting a nuclear reactor into a car? In 1957, the company introduced a concept car that was the most famous atomic automobile. It became the first development of its kind, as well as one of only 2 such cars ever created, even as a mock-up, and shown at an auto show. The car was designed down to the last detail, taking into account the need for maintenance on public roads and the risk of radiation exposure to passengers. All that was left was to create the atomic engine itself. The nuclear unit, which took up 2/3 of the car's volume and weight, was a scaled-down copy of the standard reactor from an American nuclear submarine. However, it was very difficult to shrink a 35-ton, 6-meter-tall giant down to the size of a car. In the limited space, it was necessary to fit the reactor itself, a steam generator, and 2 turbines. One was supposed to drive the wheels, and the other to power the electric generator. In principle, the idea seemed workable. The main advantage was the incredible durability of the power unit. Of course, refueling old reactors with new rods was problematic, so the vehicle was only refueled by replacing the entire reactor. But one refueling was supposed to last for 30,000 kilometers. It was planned to refuel the used reactors in factory conditions. It's similar to how, today, for example, charging stations and gas cylinder exchange stations operate. But time went on, and the compact reactor still didn't appear. And the company itself didn't have enough capacity to develop its own nuclear engine. The leading American manufacturer of submarine reactors also wasn't in a hurry to change the design of their reactors. And the ambitious project was shut down without ever really getting started. But that's not all. 5 years later, it got a continuation. In 1961, the United Nations adopted the famous declaration banning the use of nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. Accordingly, a huge number of laboratories working in this field had to suspend their research. Efforts urgently needed to be redirected toward peaceful purposes. The company's marketers noticed a certain signal in this and immediately sent tasks to the engineers to continue working on the topic. That's how 21 appeared. This time, the developers tried not to repeat the mistakes made during the construction of the previous model. In particular, they kept the traditional car layout: engine, then cabin, then a normally sized trunk. Of course, the car turned out huge, but that was in the spirit of Americans in the 60s and did not violate the average person's idea of a good car. But since a compact atomic engine still didn't exist in 1962, they had to cram as many fantastic ideas as possible into the concept, which at that time were simply impossible. These ideas attracted a lot of attention to the company itself, because the know-how that the engineers presented was half a century ahead of its time. For example, this concept car didn't have a steering wheel as such. It was suggested to control the car by touching a special panel with your fingers. This is the prototype of the modern touchscreen. There was also an onboard computer in the cabin, the interface of which somewhat resembled. And this was in the 60s, when it didn't even exist yet, and Bill Gates was only 7 years old at the time. The main purpose of the computer was to plot a route. This became the prototype of the Global Positioning System Navigator. Sensors installed throughout the body took into account the traffic situation, the proximity of other cars, and weather conditions. In fact, the engineers of that time predicted the appearance of parking sensors, rain sensors, and safety systems. The windows of the 21 had an adjustable level of tint depending on the amount of light coming from outside. The car turned out to be really cool, and at several auto shows it caused quite a sensation. But the development of this car did not go beyond the concept due to technical barriers. Well, all right, that's in America, but what about here? In the Soviet Union, atomic cars were not developed, realizing that these were initially fantastic projects. But a mobile atomic power station, several all-terrain vehicles long, was not only designed but even built and put into operation. This project was called TES-TRI, which stood for Transportable Power Station. The power unit itself was a compact dual-circuit reactor. Water was used as the working fluid, and the generator's turbine was driven by steam. The equipment was mounted on the chassis of a heavy T-10 tank and received the general name Energy Self-Propelled Vehicle. The power plant set consisted of 4 energy self-propelled vehicles. The first housed the reactor itself with shielding and an air radiator. The second contained a pair of generators and circulation pumps. The third had the turbo generator. The fourth had the control panel and backup equipment. Deploying the station took several hours. It couldn't operate while moving because all the energy self-propelled vehicles had to be connected with wires and pipelines. It was not difficult to provide shielding, since the reactor that required isolation was located on a separate energy self-propelled vehicle. They simply placed it in a sealed lead container, and during operation, the operators did not approach this self-propelled vehicle. The mobile nuclear power plant was ready for operation, and on October 13, 1961, the first experimental launch of the station took place. It performed quite well. The tests continued until 1965. But one problem arose. Neither industrialists nor scientists were able to find any practical use for this installation. It was originally designed to operate in the far north, but traditional liquid-fueled installations turned out to be simpler and cheaper. Economic impracticality forced the project to be shut down in 1969, so the unused TES-3 was mothballed. At the same time, work was underway on a second mobile nuclear power plant, Pamir 630 128 Heavy MAZ equipment was used as the chassis. In many ways, this plant was more successful than TES-3, but unfortunately, its first test launch took place in 1985, shortly before the Chernobyl disaster. Therefore, after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, most of the work in the nuclear field was shut down. Well, as for modern developments, such as the floating nuclear power plant, Akademik Lomonosov, we'll talk about them some other time. Set up notifications so you don't miss it. Or maybe it would be better to choose another topic. For example, to talk about the uranium deal, also known as the Vorno-Gor-Chernomyrdin deal of 1993. At that time, a huge amount, 500 tons of enriched uranium, was sold to the United States. Instead of 8 to 12, according to various estimates, trillion dollars, only 20 billion was received. It's like selling a brand new Mercedes, which costs 5 million, for just 12,500 rubles. This colonial, essentially deal simply saved the United States energy sector, where 98 nuclear power plants generate 20% of the country's electricity. And to this day, Russia enriches natural uranium for America. That's exactly why Rosatom owns shares in foreign companies that mine natural uranium. Let me know in the comments if this topic deserves a separate episode. Thank you for your fair assessment of this video, and see you on our channel.